I'm just doing a little few videos about some of the incredibly awkward stories of the Bible. There's been a lot of focus and attention recently in the UK around the way in which women have been mistreated. There's been a very controversial interview that happened with Meghan Markle, married to Prince Harry. It was sort of tell-all interview which with Oprah Winfrey, with lots of sharp intakes of breath. Oprah breathing out the classic "what," as as certain things got revealed and opened up and so on and so forth. So obviously there's a lot of analysis about what was said. Is it true? Who did what, etc., etc. All those kind of things. And so that's been a very current story in the UK as I speak in March 2021. And another case, a very, very tragic situation with a lady called Sarah Everard, who was murdered. I think certainly the charges, whether the conviction has gone through, not yet, but the charge certainly has been made against a policeman who then buried the body, and a lot of heartbreak, and it's brought up a lot of concern, obviously regarding the police. Meghan Markle's situation brought up a lot of concerns around authority in the royal family and so on, and so these things bring up a lot of stuff for people personally, nationally, and a lot of very strong feeling. And what's interesting, Matthew chapter 1 in the Bible, in the Gospel, the Bible doesn't kind of shy away from incredibly awkward stories, painful stories, very difficult stories of power against vulnerability, stories of abuse, stories of brokenness in relationships and so on. The Bible doesn't shy away from all that. In actual fact, it touches some of these very raw nerves. And incredibly, it touches them in the genealogy, in the heritage of Jesus, no less. It raises these questions bang on, and yet we see God's redemptive purpose in the middle of it all as well. So I just want to mention Matthew chapter 1 and verse 6, and it goes on to say this: "And Jesse, the father of King David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife." Now Solomon became very famous, but his mother was somebody who had him as a child out of an adulterous relationship. And David was challenged by Nathan the prophet that he actually ended up constructing a really horrible, awful scheme. He fell into adultery. He got involved in an adulterous relationship. He tried to then cover it all up. He arranged for Uriah, the woman's husband, to be killed on the battlefield in a very sort of conniving way, really. And in the end, all this came out into the light. And so, there are many situations where people get drawn into stuff and drawn into brokenness, and there's terrible heartache that sometimes comes as a result of destroyed relationships, of betrayed relationships, of abuse, of seizing hold of vulnerability and taking advantage of it. And the Bible doesn't go away from this, but it addresses it even in this part of Matthew, even at the very beginning of Matthew, strangely enough, with some of the introduction about Jesus, is this redemptive story of how God takes what appears to be complete mess and then turns it around. And I think that's very precious, because we need to recognize that there are many, many messy situations in the world. I was listening to a documentary that was ABC News in the States. They'd pursued a case, very complicated case, where so much heartache had happened. And we hear these stories And we hear these stories of how people have power and use that against women particularly, and so on. And we recognise, we think like there's something deeply wrong about that, something deeply unjust about this, where those who are more vulnerable and weaker in any sense are exploited or used or taken advantage of, or drawn into a situation where they comply, maybe because of pressure, because of violence, because of finance, because of all sorts of reasons, because of deception, and yet God can move in the middle of all that situation and work in such a way as to redeem those lives, redeem even the outcome of what's gone on, and turn it round. And so my prayer today is that God would just take hold of our lives again. If you're in a situation where you've had a right mess, where it feels like you've really blown it and messed up in relationships, even in something like David did with there was adultery going on, there was murder going on, there was awful stuff happened, and it felt like, that's beyond the pale. How can you come back from all that? How can you get that sorted out? The consequences will remain, but God can come in, even in the middle of all that, and bring his redemptive purpose still at the end of the day, and change things. We have to face up to what we've done wrong. We have to face the realities of it. We have to face it and deal with the consequences of it and the outcomes of it. But God is also at work in redeeming even the worst of messes. And I pray that you will experience that today, that we will experience that afresh. We will experience God's redemptive power at work, and his healing and restoration where damage has been done, where damage has deeply affected people's lives, where some things we can't change. David couldn't change what happened to Uriah. Ultimately, once he'd been murdered, he couldn't get the guy back. The impact of that was something that was irreparable. But even in all that, God worked despite David's serious errors. Even in all that, God worked to bring a purpose to Solomon's life. Even in all that, God worked in the next generation and beyond. Even in all the mistakes that happened, God can still work despite us, despite our failures, despite our errors, despite our grave mistakes. And so I pray that today we will know that truth afresh and see the reality of that come about, that God can take hold of all our muddle, and as we surrender it over to him, he can sort it all out and begin to chart a path forward in his redemptive plan for you and for me.